There was a forest on the outskirts of town that everyone avoided. Locals called it the Whispering Woods. It wasn't marked on any map, and no one knew exactly where it began or ended. But everyone knew the stories, the tales of people who ventured in and never came out, of strange sounds and shadows that seemed to follow you just out of sight. It started as a dare. Jack, always the thrill-seeker, bet his friends he could spend an entire night in the Whispering Woods. He wasn't afraid of ghost stories or local legends. To him it was all just nonsense, old tales meant to scare children. So one Friday evening, armed with a flashlight and his phone, Jack set out to prove everyone wrong. The woods were denser than he expected. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to close in on him the deeper he went. The air was thick, heavy with a musty smell that made it hard to breathe. As he walked, the light from his flashlight seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely illuminating the path ahead. After about an hour, he found a small clearing and decided it was as good a spot as any to set up camp. He gathered some wood for a fire, but every time he tried to light it, the matches fizzled out. Frustrated, he gave up and settled against a tree, pulling out his phone to check the time. No signal. Typical. As the night wore on, the forest grew eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Then, just as Jack was starting to drift off, he heard it, a faint whisper, almost like a breeze but with words. He couldn't make out what it was saying, but it seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods. Curiosity got the better of him. He stood up, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound. The whispering grew louder, but it was still just beyond his understanding, like a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. He started walking toward it, drawn in by the inexplicable urge to know what was being said. The deeper he went, the louder the whispers became, until they surrounded him, coming from all directions. His flashlight began to flicker, casting eerie shadows that twisted and danced around him. Panic set in, but he kept moving, determined to find the source. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way and he tumbled down a steep slope, landing hard at the bottom. His flashlight shattered on impact, leaving him in total darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Jack scrambled to his feet, trying to get his bearings, but the darkness was absolute. Then he saw it, a faint glow coming from a massive tree in the center of a small clearing. The tree was ancient, its bark twisted and gnarled, with roots that snaked across the ground like grasping fingers. The glow seemed to emanate from within the tree itself, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Against his better judgment, Jack approached the tree. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. Carved into the bark were hundreds of names, some faded with age, others fresh as if they had been etched just moments before. And there, near the base of the tree, was his name, glowing faintly in the dim light. Before he could react, the ground around the tree began to tremble, and the roots sprang to life, wrapping around his ankles and pulling him towards the tree. He struggled, but the roots were impossibly strong, dragging him closer and closer to the pulsating trunk. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his head with a cacophony of voices. They were speaking directly to him, and now he understood. The tree was hungry and it fed on fear. The names carved into its bark were the souls it had claimed, and Jack was about to become one of them. As the roots pulled him into the tree, the last thing Jack saw was his name, glowing brighter than ever before everything went dark. The next morning, his friends found his phone at the edge of the woods, but there was no sign of Jack. The Whispering Woods had claimed another victim, and the tree stood silently, waiting for the next foolish soul to wander too close. If you listen closely on a still night, you might hear the whispers of those it has taken, warning you to stay away, but by then it's already too late. Gold. There's something about it that has always fascinated people. Wars have been fought over it, entire civilizations built on it, and men have killed for it. I used to think gold was just another commodity, a shiny metal with no real value other than what we gave it. But after what I saw in the summer of 2017, I know better now. There's something wrong with gold. Something ancient. Something cursed. It all started when my uncle Mason died. He was an old man, a prospector, and a bit of a hermit. He had spent the better part of his life searching for gold in the remote mountain ranges of the Pacific Northwest. Most people thought he was crazy, wandering those rugged hills year after year, following old maps and legends. I never thought much of it. Everyone has their quirks. But after he passed, I found out there was a lot more to his obsession than I ever knew. Mason didn't leave behind much: a ramshackle cabin, a rusted-out truck, and a safe full of notebooks, maps, and odd trinkets. As his only living relative, the responsibility of sorting through his stuff fell to me. I wasn't exactly thrilled about it, but I owed it to him. After all, he was family, and though we weren't close, he had always been kind to me when I was a kid. I took a few days off work and drove out to his cabin. It was deep in the wilderness, far from any town or cell service, nestled between jagged cliffs and dense pine forests. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sound was the rustle of the trees in the wind. The place had an eerie stillness to it, like time had forgotten it existed. When I arrived, I found the cabin just as I remembered it: small, dark, and cluttered. Mason had lived there for decades, and it showed. Dust covered every surface, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old tools, jars of mysterious substances, and books. Lots of books, mostly on geology, mining, and old folklore. But it was the safe in the corner of the room that caught my attention. It was massive, old, and covered in layers of grime. I had no idea what he kept in there, but curiosity got the better of me. After a few frustrating hours of trial and error, I managed to crack the combination. Inside, I found a strange collection of items: a handful of yellowed, brittle maps, a few lumps of what looked like gold ore, and a small locked box. But it was the notebooks that drew me in. There were at least a dozen of them, all filled with my uncle's cramped handwriting. As I thumbed through the pages, I quickly realized that these weren't just journals. They were a detailed record of his search for what he called the Gilded Ones. According to Mason, the Gilded Ones were a tribe of people who had once lived in the mountains, long before the settlers arrived. The legend said they were a people obsessed with gold, not for wealth or power, but for something far darker. The Gilded Ones believed that gold had mystical properties, that it could grant immortality to those who mastered its secrets. But there was a price. The more gold they accumulated, the more it corrupted them: mind, body, and soul. Mason's notes became increasingly erratic as I read further. He wrote about ancient rituals, strange symbols carved into rocks, and dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams, of being pursued by something golden, something alive. At first, I thought it was just the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But then I found the final entry in his notebook, dated just days before his death. It simply read, "I found them." A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. I didn't know what he meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had been chasing, it had found him in the end. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the creaky old bed, listening to the wind howl outside, my mind racing with thoughts of the Gilded Ones. Was it just a story? A myth? Or had my uncle actually uncovered something terrible in those mountains? The next morning, I decided to follow Mason's trail. I didn't believe in curses or ancient gold-worshipping tribes, but I needed to know what had driven my uncle to his death. I took one of the old maps from the safe, packed some supplies, and set off into the wilderness. The map led me deep into the mountains, far from any marked trails. As I hiked, I noticed strange carvings on the rocks, symbols that matched the ones Mason had drawn in his notebook. They were crude but unmistakable: circles within circles, spirals, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible energy. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow ravine. The map indicated that this was the place. I climbed down carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. The bottom of the ravine was dark, the walls towering over me on both sides. At the far end, partially hidden by overgrown brush, was the entrance to a cave. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pushed me forward. The cave was larger than I expected, and as I ventured deeper, the air grew colder. My flashlight beam flickered across the walls, revealing more of the strange carvings. And then, after what felt like hours, I saw it. Gold. The walls of the cave were lined with it, veins of pure, glittering gold stretching as far as I could see. It was beautiful, mesmerizing even, and I could feel its pull. But there was something else in the cave, something that made my skin crawl. At the center of the chamber, half buried in the dirt, were bones. Human bones. And not just one skeleton. There were dozens of them, all piled together in a macabre display. Some were ancient, brittle and cracked, while others were fresh, the flesh still clinging to them. But what stood out the most was that each of the skulls had been painted with gold, the metal shimmering in the dim light like a mocking death mask. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. There, among the bones, was something else. It was the small locked box I had found in Mason's safe, now lying open. Inside, I could see a lump of gold, shaped into a crude amulet. It was covered in strange symbols, the same ones I had seen carved into the rocks. And then I heard it. A faint whisper so soft I almost missed it. But it was there, echoing off the walls of the cave. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw them. The Gilded Ones. They were standing at the entrance of the cave, watching me. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, but their eyes glowed with the same golden light as the metal in the walls. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their hunger. They had been waiting for me. I don't remember running. I don't remember how I got out of that cave or how I made it back to the cabin. All I know is that when I woke up, I was lying in the dirt outside, the sun high in the sky, and my hands were covered in gold dust. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But when I looked inside my backpack, I found the amulet. It was real and it was humming with energy. I left Mason's cabin that day and never went back. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night, I dream of the cave, of the bones, and of the Gilded Ones watching me from the shadows. And every morning, I find more gold dust on my hands, more of that cursed metal seeping into my life. I've tried to get rid of the amulet, to throw it away, bury it, even melt it down. But it always comes back, appearing in the most unlikely places. My car, my office, even under my pillow. It's as if the gold is alive, as if it's waiting for something. And the whispers, they're getting louder. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The Gilded Ones are coming for me. I can feel it. They want their gold back and they'll stop at nothing to get it. If you're reading this, don't go looking for the cave. Don't follow the maps and don't touch the gold. It's cursed. And once it has you in its grip, it never lets go. You don't think much about calendars. They're just everyday objects hanging on your wall or sitting on your desk. But what if I told you that a calendar can hold more power than you think? That the simple act of marking a date could summon something you can't explain, something dangerous? It was late October when I found the calendar. I just moved into a new apartment after months of searching for a decent place I could afford. The building was old, creaky floors, drafty windows, the works, but it had character and the price was right. The landlord, Mr. Harrison, was an elderly man who looked like he hadn't stepped out of the 1960s. He handed me the keys with a toothy grin and gave me a brief rundown of the building rules. Just one thing, he said, his voice raspy. The previous tenant left in a hurry. Cleaned out most of her things, but if you find anything, just toss it out. No big deal. That sounded fine to me. I didn't expect to find much. Moving in went smoothly, but as I started unpacking in the living room, I noticed something odd on the wall. A calendar. It was old-fashioned, with yellowing pages and hand-drawn illustrations of seasons. The kind of thing you might find at a flea market, charming in a vintage way. It was already flipped to October, and the previous days had small red X's marked in ink. The entire month had been filled out, except for one day, October 31st, Halloween. At first, I thought it was kind of quaint, like some sort of quirky decoration. I didn't bother taking it down. In fact, I kind of liked it. The illustrations had this old-world charm, and there was something satisfying about seeing the passage of time, day by day. But then strange things started happening. The first incident wasn't anything major, just a flickering light. I assumed it was an electrical issue. The next day, the faucet in the bathroom started leaking, which wasn't unusual in an old apartment. Then, a few nights later, I heard something strange. A faint whispering, almost like a conversation, coming from the living room. I figured it was the neighbors or maybe the wind coming through the cracks in the walls. But the whispering grew louder as the days passed. Sometimes it was just a single voice, a low murmur that I couldn't quite make out. Other times, it was multiple voices, overlapping as though an invisible crowd was gathering in my apartment. I would get up, walk into the living room and stand in the middle of the room trying to locate the source, but the moment I stepped inside, the voices would stop. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Moving can be overwhelming and I hadn't been sleeping well. But by the time October 29th rolled around, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers were happening almost every night now, always between 2 and 3 a.m., and they were becoming clearer. Sometimes I could make out fragments of sentences, though they made no sense. "He will come for you. It's almost time. You'll see." That night, I decided to stay up late and try to catch whatever was happening. I brewed a pot of coffee, settled into the couch and waited. Around 2:15 a.m. it started again. This time, the voices were unmistakable, like they were right behind me. But when I turned around, the room was empty. Then I noticed the calendar. The red X that had been marked on October 28th was gone. The date had been unmarked, as though someone had rubbed it out. I didn't remember doing that, and I hadn't even been in the room that day. But as I stared at the calendar, my unease deepened. I grabbed a pen from the coffee table, walked over to the calendar, and put a fresh X on the 28th. That's when I saw it. The X that should have been on October 27th was also missing. The ink wasn't smudged or faded. It was completely gone, like it had never been there at all. My heart raced as I checked the rest of the month. Every day I had crossed out was suddenly blank. The only marks left were the ones that had been there when I moved in, the excess from earlier in the month and Halloween still untouched. I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Harrison. It was late, but I didn't care. After a few rings, his groggy voice answered. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice trembling. "That calendar you left on the wall, was it yours? Did the last tenant leave it?" He was silent for a moment and then he sighed. I was hoping you wouldn't notice that damn thing. The last tenant left it. She was obsessed with it, said it was part of her rituals. I don't know much about it." She kept to herself. "But after a while, she just vanished." "Vanished?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. "Yeah, left without a word. No note, no forwarding address. The police came around, did their investigation, but they couldn't find a trace of her. Just gone." My grip tightened on the phone. "And the calendar?" "That thing's been on the wall for as long as I can remember. The tenant before her had it too. Same thing, obsessed. People get weird about it. I was gonna take it down, but every time I try, something happens." "Something?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Yeah. Lights flicker, doors slam. I'm not superstitious, but it's almost like the damn thing doesn't want to be moved. So I stopped trying. No one's ever stayed long enough to ask about it until you." I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. There was something about the calendar, something wrong. But I didn't know what to do. The next day, October 30th, I went back to the calendar with fresh resolve. I stared at Halloween, the one day that remained unmarked. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I had this nagging feeling that something terrible was going to happen if I didn't figure it out. I spent hours that night trying to stay awake, watching the calendar, waiting for something to happen. And then, as the clock hit midnight, I heard it. A single, distinct whisper. "Mark it." My heart stopped. I whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty. But the voice, it had been so close. Almost in my ear. I turned back to the calendar, trembling. The X that had been on October 30th had disappeared, just like the others. I grabbed the pen, my hand shaking, and stared at the unmarked day of October 31st. I don't know why, but every fiber of my being screamed not to touch it. But I couldn't resist. Slowly, I raised the pen to the calendar, but before I could make the mark, a loud crash came from the living room. The sound of glass breaking. I dropped the pen and ran out of the bedroom, my heart pounding. The living room window had shattered, the curtains flapping wildly in the breeze. But that wasn't the worst part. Outside, in the street below, was a figure, standing motionless under the dim glow of the street lamp. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but I could make out her pale, bony hands as they reached toward the window. "No," I whispered, backing away. No, no, no. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the room like a chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. Mark it. Finish it. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, my back pressed against the wood. The whispers were inside now, filling the air, vibrating through my skull. I stumbled toward the calendar, desperate, but when I looked up, I froze. The excess were gone. All of them. The entire month of October had been wiped clean, except for one day, October 31st. And under that date, in bold, crimson ink, was a single word. You. Suddenly, the door behind me rattled violently as if something, or someone, was trying to force their way in. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out my thoughts. I grabbed the pen and scratched a frantic X across the date, hoping it would stop whatever was coming for me. But it didn't. The door burst open and the room went silent. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around slowly, my body stiff with fear. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes were hollow, empty black pits that seemed to suck the light out of the room. She stepped forward, her movements slow, deliberate, and with each step, the room grew colder. I tried to scream, to move, but I was frozen in place. She reached out, her fingers long and thin, her touch as cold as ice. As her hand closed around my wrist, I felt a sharp pain like needles piercing my skin. My vision blurred and I felt myself slipping away. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the calendar. The X I had drawn was gone, and in its place, the word you had been written again, this time in blood. When I woke up, I was no longer in my apartment. I was lying on the cold, hard floor of an unfamiliar room, surrounded by old, tattered calendars, each one marked with excess and dates that I couldn't make sense of. The whispers were gone, but the dread remained. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I'll ever find my way out. But one thing is clear. The calendar isn't just an object. It's a trap. A doorway to something far darker than I could have ever imagined. And now I'm part of it. Halloween had always been special in my small town. Every year, the whole place seemed to transform overnight into a carnival of horror. Pumpkins sat on every doorstep, their crooked smiles lit by flickering candlelight, and skeletons dangled from trees, swaying in the cool autumn breeze. But there was something different about this Halloween. Something darker. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another year of spooky decorations, haunted houses, and kids running from door to door begging for candy. But the rumors had started circulating weeks before the holiday. They whispered about the return of the Lantern Man. It was just a story, a piece of local folklore, or so I thought. The kind of tale parents tell their kids to scare them into behaving. The Lantern Man was supposed to be some long-dead spirit who roamed the town every Halloween night, carrying an old-fashioned lantern. He'd appear on the outskirts, in the woods or along the empty roads, his face hidden beneath a hood. The story went that if you saw his lantern flicker in the distance, you had to turn away and run, or else he'd follow you. And if he caught you, well, no one really knew what happened then. But this year the stories felt more real. People had been seeing strange things. A flickering light in the woods late at night, footsteps where there shouldn't be any, and shadows moving in the trees. Some even claimed to have seen the Lantern Man himself, standing at the edge of the forest, watching. I didn't believe in the Lantern Man. At least not until Halloween night. I was 17 that year, just a bit too old for trick-or-treating, but still young enough to enjoy the thrill of Halloween. My friends and I had planned to spend the night at Mason's house, hanging out in his garage, swapping ghost stories and watching horror movies. It was a typical Halloween for us. Around 10 p.m., after a few rounds of candy trading and some half-hearted scares, Mason suggested we head out to the woods behind his house. It was part of a larger forest that stretched for miles, a dark and creepy place, especially at night. "I bet we can find the Lantern Man," he said with a mischievous grin. We all groaned, knowing he was just trying to freak us out. But the challenge had been made, and none of us wanted to back down. After all, it was Halloween, and what's a better way to spend the night than chasing after some local legend? So, armed with nothing but a couple of flashlights and our false bravado, we set off into the woods. The night was cool and the air smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke. The further we walked, the quieter it became. No trick-or-treaters, no distant sounds of laughter or parties, just the wind rustling through the trees and the crunch of dead leaves beneath our feet. We wandered deeper into the woods, joking and laughing to keep the mood light, but something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of tension that none of us could shake. The deeper we went, the more I started to feel like we were being watched. Suddenly Emma, one of my friends, stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. I followed her gaze, my heart skipping a beat. Through the trees, maybe 100 yards away, there was a light, a faint, flickering glow. It could have been anything, maybe just a trick of the light or someone else out in the woods with a lantern. But the way it moved, swaying slowly, unnaturally, made my skin crawl. Mason laughed, but it sounded forced. "Okay, very funny. Someone's trying to prank us." But no one else was laughing. The light grew closer, cutting through the darkness like a beacon, and with it came a sound, slow, deliberate footsteps. Whoever or whatever was holding that lantern was walking toward us, and fast. "Let's get out of here," Emma said, her voice trembling. We all turned and started to walk back the way we came, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the light was still there, still following, and even closer now. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the underbrush with an eerie rhythm. We broke into a run. I don't remember much of the sprint through the woods, just the pounding of my heart in my ears and the branches whipping against my face as I tried to keep up with the others. Every few seconds I'd glance back, and each time the lantern was closer, bobbing in the darkness like it was floating. We burst out of the woods and into Mason's backyard, gasping for breath. The safety of his house was only a few yards away. But as we reached the porch, Mason froze, staring at something behind us. I turned, my stomach knotting with fear. There, at the edge of the woods, the lantern swayed in the dark. And standing beneath it was a figure, tall, draped in a black hooded cloak. I couldn't see its face, but I didn't need to. The way it stood, motionless except for the slight sway of the lantern, was enough to send shivers down my spine. We bolted inside, slamming the door behind us. For a long time none of us said a word. We just sat there, breathing hard, staring at each other, trying to process what we'd just seen. We stayed in Mason's house for the rest of the night, too terrified to go back outside. We didn't talk much after that, just sat in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time morning came, it almost felt like a bad dream. The daylight made everything seem less frightening, more rational. Maybe it had just been some elaborate Halloween prank. Maybe someone had been out there messing with us. But deep down I knew better. A few days later, I was walking home from school when I noticed something odd. There, on the sidewalk in front of my house, was a single, small, carved pumpkin. Its face was twisted into a crude, eerie grin, and inside, instead of a candle, there was a tiny, flickering lantern. It wasn't something I'd put there. I bent down, feeling a chill run through me as I picked it up. The pumpkin felt cold, almost unnaturally so, and as I turned it over, I saw a small note crudely scrawled on the bottom. "See you next Halloween." I dropped the pumpkin and ran inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I locked the door and closed the blinds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. That night as I lay in bed I couldn't sleep. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the house sent my nerves on edge. And just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, the soft, distant sound of footsteps outside my window. I didn't dare look. I was never supposed to find the camera. It was just one of those things you stumble upon by accident, buried under a pile of junk in the back of a dusty old thrift shop. It was an ancient film camera, the kind my grandfather used to have, with a worn leather strap and metal casing that had seen better days. The brand name was faded, almost scratched off, but there was a certain charm to it. Something about the way it sat there, tucked away and forgotten, made me want to bring it back to life. I wasn't much of a photographer, but I figured it would make a nice prop for my growing collection of vintage items. I took it to the counter, paid a few bucks, and didn't think much more of it, until I got home and realized there was still a roll of film inside. That's when things started getting strange. I decided to get the film developed out of sheer curiosity. I didn't expect much. The film was probably long expired and whatever photos were on it would be washed out, blurred, or completely ruined. But the guy at the photo lab didn't even blink when I handed it over, just nodded and told me to come back in a couple of days. When I returned, he had a puzzled expression on his face. "Interesting shots," he said, sliding the envelope of photos across the counter. "Who took these?" "I'm not sure," I replied. "I just found the camera." He raised an eyebrow but didn't ask any more questions. I paid and left, opening the envelope as soon as I was out the door. The photos weren't what I was expecting. There were about 20 in total, but they were all dark, underexposed, and grainy. I had to squint to make out the details, but even then they didn't make sense. They were all pictures of people. Men, women, children, some young, some old. The faces were always out of focus, blurred like someone had moved the camera at the last moment, but their eyes were the only things in focus, and they all seemed to be looking directly at the lens, directly at me. Some were wide with fear, others were empty, hollow. A few looked almost desperate, as if they were begging for something. But the most unsettling part was the background. Every picture was taken in the same place, a room that seemed to stretch endlessly, with peeling wallpaper and a bare wooden floor. There were no windows, no doors, just that same endless room. I flipped through the photos again, feeling a chill run down my spine. How did someone take these? And why were they all so disturbing? I tried to forget about it. I shoved the photos back in the envelope and pushed it to the back of a drawer, telling myself I was being paranoid. But that night I had a nightmare. I was standing in a dark, endless room just like in the photos. I could barely see anything, but I could hear whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder and I started running, even though I didn't know where I was going. The room seemed to stretch on forever, the walls warping and twisting as I ran. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the click of a camera shutter. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned around. There, at the far end of the room, was a figure holding a camera, its face hidden in shadow. The camera flashed and everything went white. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of the shutter echoing in my head. It was just a dream, I told myself. But when I got up to get a drink of water, I noticed something odd. The camera was no longer where I'd left it. I'd put it on a shelf in my living room, but now it was sitting on the coffee table, pointed directly at my bed. I laughed it off, telling myself I must have moved it and forgotten, but the unease lingered. I picked it up and checked the film compartment, expecting it to be empty. But there was a fresh roll inside. I hadn't put it there. I should have just thrown the camera out then and there. But instead, I took the roll of film and loaded it into the camera. Something inside me needed to know. I snapped a few shots around the apartment, my messy living room, the pile of dishes in the sink, the view out the window. Then I set the camera down and tried to forget about it. A few days later, I went back to the photo lab. The same guy was there, and this time he looked nervous, almost pale. "You brought in more film?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Why?" He hesitated, then handed me the envelope. "Take a look." I opened it and nearly dropped the photos. The pictures I'd taken were there, but they were different. The shots of my living room, the sink, the window, they were all the same, but there was something in them that hadn't been there before. In every picture, there was a figure standing just out of focus, partially obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline of a head, a shoulder, a hand. And in every photo, the figure was holding a camera pointed straight at me. I flipped through them, my hands shaking, and realized something even more disturbing. The figure was getting closer. In the first few shots, it was just a vague shape in the background. But by the last photo, it was almost at the center of the frame, as if it had been slowly approaching with every shot I took. I shoved the photos back into the envelope, trying to steady my breathing. "Is this some kind of joke?" I asked the guy behind the counter, my voice shaking. He shook his head, looking genuinely scared. "I swear I didn't do anything to them. That's how they came out." I didn't know what to say. I just left, clutching the envelope in my hands, my mind racing. When I got home, I threw the camera into a box and shoved it into the back of my closet. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to think about it. But that night the dreams came back. I've always been a collector. It started with coins, then postcards, and eventually I found my way to vintage pins and brooches. There's something fascinating about them, like each one holds a tiny piece of history, a small fragment of someone's life. Some are elegant, some are playful, and some, well, they have their own stories. But there's one pin I wish I'd never found. One pin that, if I could, I would destroy and forget about forever. But it won't let me. No matter how hard I try to get rid of it, it keeps coming back. It all started about 6 months ago when I stumbled upon an estate sale. It was one of those last-minute finds, a rambling old house at the edge of town that had been abandoned for years. I was about to head home when I saw the sign and decided to check it out. The house itself was crumbling, with ivy crawling up the sides and windows caked in dust, but it had that sort of charm that draws in curious people like me. I wandered through the rooms, picking through old furniture, knickknacks, and clothes. That's when I found it. The pin was sitting on a small, polished wooden box, almost as if it had been placed there on display. It was simple but beautiful, an antique gold pin shaped like a tiny black rose, with delicate leaves curling around it. The petals were dark, almost black, but they seemed to shimmer when the light hit them just right. It looked older than anything else I'd seen at the sale, and it was strange because it didn't have a price tag. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. There was something written on the back, but the inscription was too worn to read clearly. All I could make out was a date, 1932. I felt an odd chill as I held it, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just because the house was cold or because I'd been standing in a drafty room for too long. Find something you like? The estate sale manager had appeared out of nowhere, giving me a startled jolt. Yeah, this pin, I said. How much? He looked at it, then at me, and his expression darkened for a moment. That pin? It's not supposed to be for sale. Well, it was just sitting out here, I said, a bit defensively. Are you sure? I'd really like to buy it. He hesitated, then sighed. Fine, take it. Just, be careful with it, all right? He didn't explain what he meant, and I didn't ask. I paid for the pin, tucked it into my pocket, and left the house, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. It was only later that I started to wonder why he'd given it to me for free. I wore the pin for the first time the next day. I pinned it to my jacket, and as soon as I did, I felt a strange prick like the pin had stabbed me. But when I checked, there was no blood, no puncture mark, nothing. Just a dull, throbbing ache that faded after a few seconds. I didn't think much of it at first. The pin looked good, and I felt a little thrill when I caught people admiring it, asking where I'd found it. But then things started to get weird. It began with small things. I'd set the pin down on my dresser at night, but in the morning I'd find it somewhere else, on my bedside table, on the floor, even in the kitchen. At first I thought I was just being forgetful, maybe moving it without realizing. But then one night I woke up to find the pin resting on my chest, right above my heart, as if someone had carefully placed it there while I was asleep. I didn't sleep much after that. The dreams started a few days later. They were strange, vivid, and always the same. I'd be standing in a dark room with no windows and no doors, and there'd be a faint, rhythmic sound in the distance. It took me a while to realize it was the sound of a heartbeat. My heartbeat. I could feel it, slow and heavy, echoing through the room. Then I'd see her. A woman dressed in a dark, flowing dress with long, tangled hair that hid her face. She'd stand at the far end of the room, just out of reach, and she'd be holding something in her hand, something small and shiny. The pin. She never said anything, never moved. She'd just stand there, staring at me, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I'd check the pin, and every time, it would be back on my dresser as if nothing had happened. I thought I was losing my mind. I tried to get rid of the pin. I threw it away, left it in a park, even drove out to the middle of nowhere and buried it. But every time it would reappear, right back where I'd left it the night before. I told a few friends about it, hoping someone might have an explanation, but they just laughed it off, said I was imagining things. One of them, Lisa, offered to take the pin off my hands for a while, just to prove that it wasn't cursed or haunted or whatever I thought it was. I was hesitant, but I was also desperate. So I gave it to her, hoping that would be the end of it. The next morning, I got a call from Lisa's roommate. Lisa had been found unconscious in her apartment, lying on the floor with the pin clutched in her hand. They took her to the hospital and she woke up a few hours later, but she couldn't remember what had happened. She gave the pin back to me and I didn't argue. I started researching the pin, trying to find out where it had come from, who had owned it before. I went back to the estate sale house, but it was boarded up with no sign of the people who'd been running it. I searched online in antique shops, libraries, but I found nothing. No mention of a pin like this, no stories, no records. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. But the dreams kept getting worse. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, with the sound of that heartbeat echoing in my ears. The woman was getting closer now, her hand reaching out as if she was trying to give me the pin. One night, I woke up and found myself standing in front of my mirror, the pin already in my hand, my fingers trembling. I didn't remember getting out of bed. I didn't remember picking it up. But there it was, shining in the dim light, and for a moment, I thought I saw the reflection of the woman standing behind me, her face hidden in the shadows. I knew I had to find out what the inscription on the back said. I took the pin to a jeweler, someone who could read the worn etching. He examined it, frowning, and when he finally made out the words, he looked at me with a strange expression. It says, "Till death parts us." I felt a chill run down my spine. What does that mean? The jeweler shrugged, but his eyes were uneasy. Could be a wedding pin. Could be something else. But this, it's not a normal inscription. It's more like a promise. A promise? I didn't like the way that sounded. That night I had the worst dream yet. I was back in that dark, endless room, but this time I wasn't alone. The woman was right in front of me, her hand stretched out, holding the pin. I could see her face now and it was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. She didn't say anything, but I could hear her voice, echoing in my head, soft and distant. Till death parts us. I woke up with a scream, my heart pounding, and when I looked down, I saw the pin was in my hand, the point pressed against my chest, just over my heart. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember moving at all. But there it was, as if it had been waiting for me. I don't know what to do anymore. I've tried everything to get rid of it, but nothing works. Every time I think I've escaped, it finds its way back, like it's attached to me, like it's part of me. The dreams are getting worse. I can barely sleep, and when I do, I wake up feeling like I can't breathe, like something is squeezing the life out of me. I'm scared to close my eyes, scared to be alone, but there's nowhere to go. I'm writing this because I don't know how much longer I can fight it. The woman in my dreams, she's closer now. I can see her, feel her, and I think she wants me to join her wherever she is. If you ever find a pin, an old black rose, leave it where it is. Don't touch it. Don't pick it up. Because once it finds you, it won't let you go. The legend of Atlas has always fascinated me. The Titan condemned to hold up the sky for all eternity, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. It was an image that seemed larger than life, a story of punishment and endurance, and I'd always found something hauntingly beautiful about it. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon a small, forgotten museum in Greece that I realized just how wrong I was. I was traveling through Europe, backpacking my way across the continent, when I found myself in a tiny coastal village. It wasn't a place you'd find on a tourist map, just a cluster of old houses and narrow streets, with the sea stretching endlessly in the distance. I was tired and hungry, looking for a place to rest, when I saw the sign, Museum of the Lost Myths. It sounded like a tourist trap, but I was intrigued. I had time to kill, and I'd always been a sucker for myths and legends. So I paid the small entry fee and stepped inside, not knowing that it would be a decision I'd come to regret. The museum was unlike any I'd ever seen. It was dark, with narrow hallways that twisted and turned like a maze, and the air was heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. The exhibits were strange, ancient artifacts, faded paintings, and old yellowed documents, all displayed under dim lights that barely illuminated the room. I wandered through the halls, reading plaques and looking at artifacts, but nothing really stood out to me. It was just the usual stuff: statues of gods and heroes, replicas of ancient weapons, fragments of pottery. But then I found the room dedicated to Atlas, and everything changed. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with a single display case in the center. Inside was a statue about 2 feet tall of Atlas. It was different from any depiction I'd seen before. Most statues showed him standing tall, his muscles straining as he held the sky aloft. But this one was broken. Atlas was hunched over, his back twisted and bent, and his hands were gripping a jagged, uneven surface that seemed to be crushing him. His face was carved in a grimace of agony, his eyes wide and hollow, as if he was screaming but no sound could escape. The plaque in front of the statue was even stranger. It didn't tell the usual story of Atlas' punishment. Instead it said, "Atlas' burden is not the weight of the sky, but the weight of what he has seen." I didn't understand what it meant, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way the statue was carved, as if it was trying to convey a message that I couldn't quite grasp. I was about to move on when an old man appeared beside me, seemingly out of nowhere. He was the museum's curator, dressed in a worn, dark suit, with a thin, pale face and eyes that seemed too sharp, too intense. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and raspy. "Yeah," I said, though beautiful wasn't the word I'd have used. "It's different." The old man nodded, his eyes never leaving the statue. "Most people think Atlas was punished to hold up the sky, but that's not the whole truth. His burden was much greater than that. He was made to bear the weight of knowledge. The knowledge of what lies beyond, what exists in the dark places of the world, and the things that should never be seen." I stared at him, not sure if he was messing with me or if he genuinely believed what he was saying. "What do you mean?" He smiled, a thin, eerie smile that made my skin crawl. "Atlas wasn't just holding up the sky. He was holding back everything that hides beyond it. Things that want to come through. Things that shouldn't be allowed to exist in our world. And for eternity he has to keep them at bay, watching, knowing, and enduring the horror of it all." I didn't know what to say. I thought about laughing it off, but the way he was looking at me made it impossible. There was something in his eyes, something dark and hollow, that made me believe just for a moment that he was telling the truth. I left the museum soon after that, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just a creepy story, that the old man was probably just trying to scare the tourists, but the image of the broken Atlas statue stayed with me. That night I had the first of many nightmares. I was standing in the middle of a vast empty field, with the sky stretching out endlessly above me. It was dark, but not the kind of dark you get at night. It was a thick, oppressive blackness that seemed to press down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then I saw him, Atlas, standing in the distance, his back bent and twisted, his hands gripping the sky. But it wasn't just the sky. It was something else, something that moved and shifted like a mass of writhing shadows. I could hear it, a faint, whispering sound like thousands of voices speaking all at once, saying things I couldn't understand. Atlas turned, and for a moment our eyes met. His face was twisted with fear, his eyes wide and wild, and I could see something reflected in them. Something that was coming, something that was pushing against the barrier he was holding up, trying to break through. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. But it felt too real, too vivid, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a nightmare. The dreams didn't stop. Every night, I'd find myself in that field, watching Atlas struggle to hold back the dark, shifting mass. And every night, it seemed to get closer, like whatever was on the other side was getting stronger, pushing harder. I started to lose sleep, afraid of what I'd see if I closed my eyes. I tried to distract myself, to focus on other things, but nothing worked. The image of Atlas, broken and bent, was burned into my mind, and the whispers. I could hear them even when I was awake now, faint and distant, like an echo in the back of my head. I went back to the museum, desperate for answers, but when I got there it was closed. The building was boarded up, with no sign of the curator or anyone else. I asked around the village, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. Some even claimed there had never been a museum there at all. I thought about the old man's words, about Atlas bearing the weight of knowledge, and I wondered if that's what was happening to me. If somehow I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and now I was bearing the weight of it just like him. A few days later I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, no note, just a small black envelope with my name scrawled on the front. Inside was a single photograph, of the Atlas statue from the museum, but it was different. The statue was cracked, pieces of it broken off, and there was something seeping through the cracks. It looked like shadows, dark and formless, spilling out from inside the statue like it was bleeding darkness. And there, in the corner of the photograph, was a face I recognized. It was me. I dropped the photograph, my hands shaking, and that's when I heard it. The whispering, louder now, clearer, like it was right next to me. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel what they meant, a sense of dread and despair that made my chest tighten. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. I was too afraid of what I'd see, too afraid of the whispers, and the shadows that seemed to be creeping closer, no matter how much I tried to ignore them. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night and I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy and there was a faint, rhythmic sound echoing through the room, a sound I recognized. The sound of a heartbeat. I sat up, and there, at the foot of my bed, was the statue of Atlas, the same one from the museum. But it was no longer small. It was life-sized, standing tall and imposing, with cracks running down its surface. The shadows were seeping out, curling around its feet, spreading across the floor. And then I saw it. The shadows shifted and I could see eyes, hundreds of them, staring out at me from the darkness, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder and I could feel them inside my head, pulling me down, drowning me in their words. Atlas turned his head and for the first time I heard his voice. "Help me," he whispered, his voice trembling, broken. "I can't hold it back anymore." I wanted to run but I couldn't move. The shadows were closing in, and I could feel them wrapping around me, cold and suffocating. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was Atlas, his face twisted in agony as the shadows burst through the cracks and swallowed him whole. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was alone, the room empty, the statue gone. But the whispers, they're still there, louder than ever, and I can feel the weight pressing down on me like I'm holding back something that's trying to break free. I think I understand now. Atlas wasn't just a titan. He was a warning. A warning of what happens when you see too much, when you know too much. Because once you've seen what's out there, once you've felt it, you can never escape it. And now it's my burden to bear. I've always been drawn to stories of the unexplained. Ghost stories, urban legends, tales of the supernatural. There's something about them that both scares and fascinates me. So when I found myself traveling through North Africa, I couldn't resist the urge to explore the lesser-known corners of the region, the places that carried whispers of ancient curses and old, forgotten spirits. But there's one story, one night in Algeria, that I wish I could forget. I was in a small town called Jelfa, not far from Algiers. It wasn't much to look at, just a quiet, dusty town with narrow streets and old, crumbling buildings. I'd planned to take a train to the capital the next day, but as evening approached, a local told me about a train that ran late at night, a train that didn't follow any official schedule. He said it was a relic from the past, a train that had been running since before the country's independence, and if I was looking for a good story I should see if I could catch it. He told me to go to the old station, the one that hadn't been used in years, and wait. If it comes, he said, you'll hear the whistle. But be careful. They say the train doesn't just take you to Algiers. I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but I was intrigued. The idea of a ghost train, a piece of forgotten history, was too tempting to pass up. So that night I made my way to the old station. It was a crumbling, abandoned building on the outskirts of town, with overgrown tracks stretching out into the darkness. The place was completely silent, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive, as if the whole station was holding its breath. I sat on a bench, waiting, feeling a bit foolish. The minutes dragged by, and I was starting to think I'd been tricked, that the local had just been messing with me when I heard it, a distant, echoing whistle. It was faint at first, almost like a sigh, but it grew louder, closer, until I could hear the rhythmic clacking of wheels on tracks. I looked down the line, straining to see through the darkness, and there it was. A train, its headlights cutting through the night, moving slowly toward the station. It was an old steam locomotive, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs, with a cloud of smoke billowing from the engine. It was strange, almost surreal, to see something like that still running, and for a moment I felt like I'd stepped back in time. The train came to a stop in front of me, and I could see that the carriages were old and worn, their paint peeling, their windows clouded with dust. There were no passengers, no conductor, just the faint glow of lights inside. I hesitated, a sense of unease creeping over me. But then the door to one of the carriages creaked open, as if inviting me to board, and I found myself stepping forward, my curiosity getting the better of me. The inside of the train was just as old and worn as the outside. The seats were faded, the wood was scratched, and there was a musty smell, like the air hadn't been refreshed in decades. I walked down the aisle looking for a place to sit, and that's when I realized something was off. There were people in the carriage, but they weren't right. They were all dressed in clothes from different eras, some in old-fashioned suits and hats, others in more modern attire, but they all had the same vacant expression, staring straight ahead as if they were looking at something only they could see. I tried to catch someone's eye, to ask if this train really was going to Algiers, but no one even glanced at me. It was like they didn't even know I was there. I finally found an empty seat near the back and sat down, telling myself that everything was fine, that I was just imagining things. The train started moving again, slowly at first, then picking up speed, and I settled in, trying to ignore the strange, unsettling atmosphere. As we left Jelfa behind, the view outside the window was nothing but darkness, with the occasional flicker of light from a distant village. The rhythmic sound of the train was soothing, almost hypnotic, and I felt myself starting to relax, my earlier anxiety fading. But then the lights inside the carriage flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, I saw that the passengers had changed. They were still sitting in the same seats, still staring straight ahead, but their faces were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, dark pits, their skin was pale and gaunt, and their mouths were twisted into strange, unnatural smiles. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I looked away, trying to convince myself that I was just seeing things, that it was just a trick of the light. But when I looked back, they were still there, and they were all staring at me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, unable to move. The train kept moving, the sound of the wheels clattering against the tracks, but everything else was silent. The passengers didn't speak, didn't move, they just stared, their eyes empty, their smiles fixed. I wanted to get up, to get off the train, but I was afraid. Afraid that if I stood up, they'd follow me, that they'd do something I couldn't predict. So I stayed in my seat, gripping the armrest, my heart pounding in my chest. The train began to slow down, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we were stopping, maybe I could get off and find my way back to Jelfa. But when I looked out the window, I realized we weren't anywhere near Algiers. We were in the middle of the desert, with nothing but sand and rock stretching out in every direction. The train came to a halt, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the door at the front of the carriage opened, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform with a cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and as he passed, the passengers began to change again. Their smiles faded, their skin darkened, and their eyes were no longer hollow. They were full of something else, something dark and malicious, something that made my stomach turn. The conductor stopped in front of me, and for the first time I could see his face. He had no eyes, just empty sockets, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He smiled at me, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Ticket please," he said, his voice low and raspy. I didn't have a ticket. I hadn't bought one, hadn't even seen anyone selling them. I stammered, trying to explain, but he just smiled wider, as if he was enjoying my fear. "No ticket," he said, shaking his head slowly. "No journey." I don't know what I was thinking, but I jumped up, pushing past him, running down the aisle toward the door. The passengers watched me, their heads turning in unison, their dark eyes following me as I ran. I stumbled out of the carriage, onto the sand, and looked around, trying to figure out where I was. The train was just sitting there, silent, the engine no longer running, and the night sky was vast and empty above me. I turned back to look at the train, and I saw the conductor standing in the doorway, his eyeless sockets fixed on me. "You can't escape," he said, his voice echoing across the desert. "The journey isn't over." And then, before I could react, the train began to move again, slowly at first, then faster, until it disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone in the middle of the desert. I don't remember how I made it back to Jelfa. I must have walked for hours, maybe even days, until I stumbled upon a road and found someone who could help me. I tried to tell them what had happened, but they just looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd lost my mind. I left Algeria the next day, cutting my trip short. I didn't want to stay any longer, didn't want to risk seeing that train again. But even now, months later, I can't stop thinking about it, about the passengers with their hollow eyes, about the conductor and his jagged smile. I've done some research since then trying to find out if anyone else has seen the train, but there's nothing. No records, no sightings, nothing. It's like it never existed. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I think I can still hear it, the distant, echoing whistle of a train coming from somewhere far away. And I know deep down that it's still out there, still running, still waiting for its next passenger. So if you ever find yourself in Jelfa or any other small, quiet town in Algeria, and someone tells you about a train that runs late at night, don't go looking for it. Because once you board, you may never find your way back. It was almost midnight and I was driving home after a long shift at work. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since lunchtime. Most places were closed at this hour, but I remembered seeing a small burger joint a few blocks from my usual route. It wasn't a chain, just a standalone diner with a flickering neon sign that read Big Bob's Burgers. I decided to give it a try. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed that the diner seemed oddly out of place. It had an old-fashioned, almost retro look to it, like something out of the 1960s. The parking lot was empty, and the only light came from the flickering sign and the dim bulbs inside the diner. I hesitated for a moment, but my hunger won over my caution. I parked the car, got out, and pushed open the door. A small bell chimed as I stepped inside, and the smell of grilled meat hit me instantly. It was mouth-watering, and I felt my stomach rumble in anticipation. The diner was nearly empty except for a single person behind the counter. Bob, I assumed. He was a heavy-set man with a thick, graying mustache, wearing a grease-stained apron. He looked up and smiled when I walked in, but there was something strange about his smile. It was too wide, too perfect, like it was practiced. "Welcome to Big Bob's," he said, his voice gruff but friendly. "What can I get you tonight?" I glanced at the menu, which was displayed on a chalkboard above the counter. There weren't many options, just a basic burger, a cheeseburger, and something called the Midnight Special. I was tempted to ask what the special was, but I was tired and didn't feel like striking up a conversation. "I'll just have a cheeseburger," I said, keeping it simple. Bob nodded, still smiling, and turned to the grill. As he started cooking, I took a seat at one of the booths near the window. The place was eerily quiet, with no music playing, no chatter, just the sizzle of the grill and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I noticed that there were no other customers, and I wondered if the diner ever got busy. After a few minutes, Bob brought my burger over on a plain white plate. It looked pretty standard: bun, patty, cheese, lettuce, and tomato. But the smell was incredible, and I realized just how hungry I was. I thanked him and took a bite. The taste was different. It wasn't bad, just not what I was expecting. The meat was tender, almost too tender, and the flavor was richer than any burger I'd ever had. For a moment, I couldn't tell if I liked it or not, but then my hunger took over and I found myself devouring it. As I ate, I glanced around the diner, taking in the details. The place had a weird vibe, like it was stuck in time. There were old posters on the walls advertising sodas and milkshakes, but they were faded and peeling. The jukebox in the corner looked like it hadn't worked in years, and the red leather on the seats was cracked and worn. But what really caught my attention were the photos. There were dozens of them, framed and hung up all along the walls, showing different people over the years. Most of them were black and white, and they all had a similar feel: people sitting at the booths, holding up burgers, smiling for the camera. But the more I looked, the more I noticed that there was something off about the photos. The people's smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright, and there was a strange, almost haunted look in their expressions. I turned back to my burger, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over me. But as I finished the last bite, I noticed Bob watching me from behind the counter, still smiling that same too-perfect smile. "Good, isn't it?" he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile of my own. "It's different." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," Bob said. "Not everyone appreciates the midnight special." I froze. I hadn't ordered the midnight special. I was sure I'd asked for a regular cheeseburger. I opened my mouth to say something, but Bob was already moving back to the grill, humming to himself as if nothing was wrong. I glanced down at my plate and that's when I noticed it. There was something sticking out from under the bun, something small and shiny. I hesitated, then reached down and pulled it out. It was a button like the kind you'd find on a shirt, smeared with grease. My stomach churned and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wanted to get up, to leave, but I felt like I was rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. I looked around the diner again at the photos on the walls, and that's when I realized what was wrong with them. The people in the photos, they were all wearing the same clothes. The same shirts, the same jackets, the same dresses. And some of those clothes looked old, like they'd been worn and washed 100 times. But the faces were different. Different people, same clothes. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck and I turned back to Bob, who was still humming, still smiling. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What did you put in my burger?" Bob didn't answer right away. He just kept humming like he hadn't heard me. Then he turned and for the first time his smile faded. "You really want to know?" he said, his eyes boring into mine. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look on my face must have said it all. Bob sighed, almost as if he was disappointed, and wiped his hands on his apron. "You're not the first to ask," he said, his voice low. "And you won't be the last. But sometimes it's better not to know." He gestured to the photos on the wall and I felt my skin crawl. They all asked too. And they got their answers. But once you know, you can't go back. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took a step toward the door. "I think I'm going to leave now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Bob just smiled again, but this time it was different. There was no warmth in it, just a cold, calculated amusement. "The door's always open," he said. "But once you leave, you'll always come back." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I stumbled out of the diner, my heart pounding, and ran to my car. I drove home as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the taste of the burger still lingering in my mouth. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, those smiling faces staring back at me, and I heard Bob's words echoing in my head. "You'll always come back." I tried to convince myself that it was just a weird experience, that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew there was something more to it. I tried to forget about it, to move on, but I couldn't. A few nights later, I was driving home from work again, and without even thinking about it, I found myself turning down the same street, pulling into the same parking lot. The diner was still there, the neon sign still flickering, and the smell of grilled meat wafted out, beckoning me. I didn't want to go in. I wanted to drive away, to never come back, but it was like something was pulling me, something I couldn't resist. I got out of the car, walked to the door, and stepped inside. The bell chimed and Bob looked up, smiling that same too-wide smile. "Welcome back," he said. "I knew you'd be back." I don't remember much after that. I know I sat down, I know I ordered another burger, and I know I ate it even though every bite tasted like ash in my mouth. And I know that when I left, Bob gave me a photo to take with me, a black and white picture of me sitting in the booth, holding up a burger, smiling. But the weirdest part? When I got home, I looked at the photo again and I realized that I was wearing a different shirt, a shirt I didn't own. A shirt I'd never seen before. It's been weeks now and I still can't stop thinking about it. Every night, I find myself driving back to the diner, even though I know I shouldn't. I don't want to go, but I can't help it. It's like something's pulling me, something I can't escape. And every time I go, Bob gives me another photo. There are more of them now, scattered around my apartment, pictures of me, all wearing different clothes, all with that same unnatural smile. I don't know where the clothes come from or why I keep going back, but I can't stop. Maybe it's true what Bob said. Maybe once you've had the midnight special, you can't ever leave. So if you ever find yourself driving down a dark, empty road late at night, and you see a diner with a flickering neon sign, do yourself a favor. Keep driving.
I've always had a fascination with small, out-of-the-way countries. The kind of places that seem almost mythical, hidden away from the rest of the world, their names spoken with a mix of curiosity and confusion. That's what drew me to Andorra, a tiny nation tucked between France and Spain, nestled high in the Pyrenees Mountains. I'd read about its beautiful landscapes, ski resorts, and quaint villages, and I thought it would be the perfect spot for a quiet vacation. But what happened there was anything but quiet, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. It was late autumn when I arrived in Andorra. The air was crisp and cool, and the leaves had just begun to turn, painting the hillsides in shades of orange and gold. I'd booked a small cabin in a village called Saint-Jaume, which was supposed to be far off the beaten path, perfect for someone like me who wanted to escape the chaos of city life for a while. The drive there was stunning, with winding roads that twisted through the mountains, offering breathtaking views of valleys and peaks. But as I got closer to Saint-Jaume, something felt off. The road became narrower, the trees denser, and the clouds overhead seemed to darken, even though it was still early afternoon. There were no signs, no markers to indicate how far the village was, and I started to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But then I saw it, a small, wooden sign half hidden by weeds, with the words Saint-Jaume painted on it in faded, peeling letters. An arrow pointed down a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my car. I hesitated for a moment, then turned down the road, figuring I'd come this far, and I might as well see where it led. The village was different from what I'd expected. I'd pictured a charming, picturesque place with cozy cottages and friendly locals, but Saint-Jaume was almost completely deserted. The houses were old and weathered, their shutters hanging crooked, their paint peeling. There were no cars, no people walking around, just silence. I parked my car near what looked like the village square, a small, cobblestone plaza with a stone fountain in the center. The water wasn't running, and the basin was dry, with dead leaves collected at the bottom. I glanced around, hoping to see anyone, but there was no one there. It was eerie, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a quiet village, or maybe most of the residents had left for the season. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the cabin I'd rented, which was supposed to be at the far end of the village, near the edge of the forest. As I walked through the village, I noticed more strange things. The windows of the houses were dark, but I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes following me from behind the curtains. I could see faint, shadowy movements inside, but every time I looked directly at a window, the shadows would disappear. I finally reached the cabin, which looked just as old and worn as the rest of the village. There was no one there to greet me, no one to hand me the keys, but the door was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, I found the key hanging on a hook by the door. The interior was surprisingly clean, with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a single bedroom. It was cozy, almost too cozy, like someone had just been there, waiting for me to arrive. I dropped my bag and decided to take a walk around the village before it got dark. I figured I'd find someone, maybe ask where the nearest grocery store was, or get some information about the area. But as I walked, the sense of unease grew stronger. The streets were empty, the houses silent, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wandered for a while, trying to make sense of the village's layout, but it seemed to shift and change around me. I'd turn a corner and find myself back where I started, or walk down a street only to realize it led nowhere. I tried to find the road I'd driven in on, but it was gone, swallowed up by the dense trees that seemed to creep closer, inching toward the village like dark, skeletal fingers. As the sun began to set, I decided to head back to the cabin, but I couldn't find it. I was sure I'd been walking in the right direction, but every turn led me somewhere else, to a part of the village I hadn't seen before. The sky grew darker, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring everything around me. That's when I heard it, a faint, whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were close, too close, and they were getting louder. I started to panic, my heart racing, and I broke into a run, hoping to find the cabin or the car or anything familiar. But the fog grew thicker, and the voices grew louder, until they were all around me, whispering, chanting, a strange, rhythmic murmur that made my skin crawl. I stumbled through the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I saw a light flickering in the distance. I ran toward it, desperate, and found myself back in the village square, standing in front of the old fountain. The light was coming from one of the houses, a faint, yellow glow seeping through the cracks in the shutters. I hesitated, but I had no other options, so I walked up to the house and knocked on the door. The door creaked open, and an old woman stood there, her face hidden in the shadows. She was small, hunched over, with wispy white hair that fell around her shoulders. She looked up at me with pale, watery eyes and smiled, a thin, crooked smile that sent a chill down my spine. "You're lost," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm looking for my cabin," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't find it." She just nodded, as if she'd been expecting me, and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. I hesitated, but the fog was thickening, and the whispers were still there, just beyond the edge of the light, so I stepped inside. The house was dark and cold, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. The old woman led me to a small room at the back, where a single candle flickered on a wooden table. There was a map spread out on the table, a map of the village, but it was different from any map I'd seen before. The streets were twisted, looping in on themselves, and there were strange symbols drawn in the margins, symbols I didn't recognize. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely audible. "This place isn't for you." I didn't know what to say. I was scared, confused, and I just wanted to go home. "I don't understand," I said. "I just need to find my way out." The old woman looked at me for a long moment, then pointed to one of the symbols on the map. "This is a place of passage," she said. "A place between worlds. Those who enter can't leave. Not unless they're chosen." I didn't understand what she meant, but I could see the fear in her eyes, and it terrified me. "Chosen for what?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "To stay," she said, her lips curling into that same crooked smile. "To become part of the village." The candle flickered, and for a moment, I saw something in the shadows behind her. Dark, twisted shapes moving, shifting, like figures trapped in a fog. I blinked, and they were gone, but the fear remained, a cold, gnawing dread that made it hard to breathe. "I don't want to stay," I said, my voice trembling. "I just want to leave." The old woman sighed, almost as if she was disappointed, and blew out the candle. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and slimy. I recoiled, stumbling back, and heard her voice, soft and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Then you shouldn't have come here." I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, or maybe I just ran. But when I woke up, I was lying in the village square, the fog lifting, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds. The village was still there, still silent, but the feeling of being watched was gone, and the whispers had faded. I stumbled back to the cabin, found my car, and drove away without looking back. The road was clear now, and I didn't stop until I was back in the main town, far from St. John. I wanted to forget everything, to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, but I couldn't. A few days later, I tried to find the village on a map, but it wasn't there. I asked around, but no one had ever heard of St. John. It was as if the village had never existed. But I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere, high in the mountains, there's a place that shouldn't be. A place where the fog never lifts and the whispers never stop. And if you ever find yourself driving through the Pyrenees and you see a small, wooden sign pointing down a narrow dirt road, do yourself a favor. Keep driving.